March 19, 1962. Studio 6B, Rockefeller Center. The cigarette smoke hung in the amber glow of the overhead floods, and somewhere beneath the murmur of the warming audience, a young comedian named Johnny Carson adjusted his tie and wondered if control was something you seized or something you surrendered to. The Tonight Show had been floundering. Jack Paar, volcanic and brilliant, had walked off the set during a broadcast, returned months later, and finally quit for good. NBC needed stability. They needed someone who could fill 90 minutes of live television 5 nights a week without cracking, without crusading, without making the network executives nervous. They needed someone America could trust before they went to sleep. They chose a 36-year-old game show host from Nebraska who had been polite enough on daytime television that no one remembered much about him at all. This was not an honor. This was a gamble disguised as a promotion. In 1962, late-night television was not yet an institution. It was a commercial experiment, a way to sell toothpaste and automobiles to insomniacs and night shift workers. The Tonight Show had no format, no proven model. Paar had made it personal, confessional, emotionally raw. Carson was being asked to do the opposite, to be present without being personal, to be funny without being vulnerable, to command attention without ever demanding it. He was being asked to control a medium that had no rules by pretending he had none himself. The first night, October 1, 1962, Carson opened with a monologue. It was not particularly funny. The audience laughed politely, the way people laugh at weddings when the best man's toast runs long. But something else happened that night, something that would take years to recognize. Carson paused. He looked at the camera. He smiled as if he were in on a joke he had not yet told, and then he moved on. That pause, not the jokes, not the guests, not the music, was the beginning of Johnny Carson's 30-year reign over American television. It was the moment he discovered that control was not about dominating the room. It was about letting the room believe you did not need to. By 1965, appearing on The Tonight Show was no longer a publicity stop. It was an audition for the American imagination. A comedian could work 20 years in nightclubs, open for jazz singers, bomb in Chicago, and triumph in Miami, and none of it mattered until Johnny Carson laughed. If Carson laughed, not the producers, not the audience, but Carson himself, you had a career. If he invited you to the couch after your set, you had a future. If he did not, you went back to the clubs and tried to figure out what you had done wrong. This was not a rule anyone wrote down. It was not a policy NBC enforced. It was simply understood, the way certain truths about power are understood without being explained. Carson did not create this system. He did not ask for it, but he did not reject it either. He understood, perhaps earlier than anyone, that late-night television was not about entertainment. It was about permission.
The networks had tried to manufacture stars before. They'd given comedians their own variety shows, their own specials, their own time slots. Most failed within a season. Carson's show did not fail because it did not try to be a show. It was a laboratory. Every night, Carson tested new material, new guests, new ways of holding an audience's attention without ever appearing to try. And every night, America watched to see what he would decide was funny, what he would decide was interesting, what he would decide mattered. The power was invisible, and that made it absolute. The moment came in 1969, during a week when the country was not sure what to feel. The Apollo 11 astronauts had returned from the moon, the war in Vietnam was metastasizing, the Manson murders had just broken in Los Angeles, and the nation was beginning to understand that the optimism of the early 60s had curdled into something darker, something no one had a name for yet. Carson had spent the week interviewing politicians, actors, scientists, people who spoke in careful sentences designed not to offend anyone. It was good television, in the sense that it was professional and smooth and forgettable. And then, on Friday night, Carson did something no one expected. He sat at his desk, alone, and read a letter. It was from a soldier in Vietnam. The letter was not angry, not political, not tearful. It was simply tired. The soldier wrote that he and his unit watched The Tonight Show whenever they could, on a black and white television in a tent, the signal weak and crackling. He wrote that the show reminded them that somewhere people were still laughing. He wrote that Johnny Carson made them feel like they were still part of the country they were supposedly fighting for. Carson read the letter without commentary. He did not editorialize, he did not thank the soldier, he did not pivot to a joke. He simply folded the letter, placed it on the desk, and said, "We'll be right back." The audience did not know whether to applaud. The camera held on Carson's face for a half-second longer than usual, and in that moment, something shifted. The show had always been a performance, a carefully constructed illusion of spontaneity, but for that one moment, the illusion cracked, and what the audience saw underneath was not chaos or vulnerability. It was control so complete that Carson could choose, deliberately, to let it go. The desk became the symbol. Not the curtain, not the microphone, not Ed McMahon's laugh, though all of those mattered. The desk was where Carson sat every night, the physical barrier between himself and the audience, between the performance and the person. It was oak, heavy, immovable. It had a microphone embedded in the surface, a cup for pencils, a drawer where Carson kept his monologue cards. It was not ornate, it was not modern, it was simply there, solid and dependable, like Carson himself. But the desk was also a stage prop, a tool. Carson used it the way a magician uses a table, drawing attention to it precisely so you would not notice what his hands were doing. When a joke bombed, Carson would tap the desk, as if acknowledging the failure and moving on. When a guest said something unexpected, Carson would lean back, putting the desk between himself and the moment, giving himself time to decide how to react. When he wanted to signal that a conversation was over, he would shuffle papers on the desk, a gesture so subtle that most people did not register it consciously, but the guest always did. The desk was not furniture. It was a language.
And over 30 years, that language became fluent to millions of people who had never met Johnny Carson and never would. They knew the tap that meant, "I tried." They knew the lean back that meant, "I'm listening." They knew the paper shuffle that meant, "We're done here." They did not think of it as control because it did not feel like control. It felt like conversation. That was the trick. That was the entire architecture of Johnny Carson's power. He made authority feel like intimacy. By the 1970s, Carson was not just hosting a television show, he was shaping the national conversation in ways that no one fully understood, including Carson himself. When he mocked a politician, that politician's career trajectory changed. When he endorsed a product during a monologue, casually, almost accidentally, that product sold out. When he decided a news story was worth a joke, it entered the cultural lexicon. When he decided it was not, it faded. This was not because Carson was a tastemaker or a pundit. It was because he had become the voice America heard before it went to sleep, the last word on whether something mattered or whether it was just noise. And Carson understood something that most people in power do not, that the appearance of not caring is more powerful than the appearance of caring too much. He never lectured. He never preached. He never told the audience what to think. He simply reacted, and his reactions became the template for how millions of people processed the world. When Richard Nixon appeared on the show in 1972 during the presidential campaign, Carson asked him to play the piano. It was a soft question, almost silly. Nixon played Happy Birthday stiffly, and the audience applauded politely. Carson smiled, thanked him, and moved on. The next day, political analysts debated whether Nixon had humanized himself or revealed his awkwardness. But the real story was that Carson had made the decision to let Nixon appear at all,
and that by asking a harmless question, he had diffused the danger of the moment. Carson had decided that Nixon would not be challenged on his show, and so Nixon was not challenged. The power was in the absence of the question. But there were cracks. In 1979, Carson went through a public divorce. His third marriage dissolved in tabloid headlines, and for the first time, the private man and the public persona did not align. Carson made jokes about it, of course. He always made jokes. But the jokes had an edge now, a brittleness. The audience laughed, but they also felt something else, something like discomfort or recognition. For 30 years, Carson had been in control. He had controlled the format, the guests, the tone, the pacing, the meaning of every moment on The Tonight Show. But he could not control his personal life, and suddenly the illusion wavered. People began to wonder, who was Johnny Carson when the cameras turned off? Carson never answered that question. He gave interviews, but he never said anything. He wrote an autobiography, but it was ghostwritten and revealed nothing. He retired in 1992, gave a final monologue that was restrained and graceful, and then he disappeared. For the last 13 years of his life, he did not appear on television. He did not give speeches. He did not attend award shows. He simply stopped, as if the performance had ended and there was no reason to continue.
Some called it dignity, others called it isolation, but perhaps it was the final act of control, choosing the moment to leave, choosing silence over nostalgia, choosing to let the desk remain empty rather than let someone else sit behind it. The night Johnny Carson lost control, on purpose, was not a single night. It was every night. Every time he paused after a joke and let the silence linger. Every time he allowed a guest to ramble and did not interrupt. Every time he acknowledged a mistake, a technical error, a moment when the show did not go as planned. These are not accidents. They were choices. Carson understood that control is not the absence of chaos. It is the decision to allow chaos, briefly, so that the audience remembers you are the one who can stop it. The Tonight Show was not a variety show. It was not a talk show. It was a demonstration, every night for 30 years, of what power looks like when it does not need to announce itself. Carson never raised his voice. He never fired anyone on camera. He never humiliated a guest who deserved it. He simply sat at the desk, adjusted his tie, and decided what mattered. And for a generation of Americans, what mattered was what Johnny Carson decided to care about for 90 minutes before they went to sleep. The desk is still there, somewhere in storage. The microphone has been disconnected. The applause sign was sold at auction years ago. But the idea remains. The idea that authority can be gentle, that power can be quiet, that a man can control a nation's attention every night for 3 decades without ever demanding it. Johnny Carson did not invent late-night television. He invented the feeling that late-night television mattered, not because it was important, but because he was present. And presence, sustained over years, becomes authority. Authority unspoken becomes trust. The Tonight Show ended in 1992, but the architecture of what Carson built remains. Every late-night host since has sat behind a desk, adjusted their tie, and tried to replicate the pause, the lean back, the subtle signal that they are in control without needing to prove it. None have succeeded completely, because none have understood what Carson understood, that control is not about what you do, it is about what you allow. And Johnny Carson allowed America to believe every night that somewhere in the chaos of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, somewhere between the wars and the scandals and the uncertainty, there was a man in a suit who would sit at a desk and make sense of it all, not by explaining it, but by simply being there when the lights came on. That was the performance. That was the trick. That was the entire magic of Johnny Carson. And it worked, night after night, until the very last moment, when he stood, waved,
and walked off the stage, leaving the desk behind him, empty and perfect and silent.